good time to start. I think everybody's here. Okay, I'm giving the usual update this year on the progress we've made in the kernel client and server. I'll give an overview of it, talk about some recent improvements, and talk about what's coming soon. But I also like to just step back. We just heard a talk on memory management that was very interesting, but what's actually going on in the kernel? 78,000 change sets, that's not too bad, right? I'm sure Linus reviews every single one, right? 41,000 files changed. Now that's up a lot. Now that's kind of curious why. 3.3 million insertions, that's pretty amazing. Kernel's 28.8 million lines of code. Even bigger than Samba. Samba's only like 4. Now, in the last year, we've gone from the 6.11 kernel last September to 6.17 now. But Linus, unfortunately, has not changed the name. He usually has these quirky names, but he decided not to change the names. Now, one thing that impresses me is the Linux kernel community, the file system developers, memory management developers, tend to be very smart people. Very opinionated, but very smart. Here's some pictures from File System Summit every year. Next year, it'll be in Croatia. This year it was in Montreal. It's a very interesting thing to see these developers getting together and arguing about important things, but also, I do find it a very good group to work with. Now, during these things, lots of things come up. We've talked about KDevOps in past years, the automated testing used by Google, and there's good presentations that Lewis Chamberlain has done on that. There's a lot of talk about the NetFs mapping layer, folios, variable size pages, FS cache, improving page caching, compression in the page cache, encrypting. There are some recent discussions about improvements to StatX for subvolumes and snapshots, finer grained timestamps. The Rust discussions were very dramatic the year before last year, 18 months ago. The Rust maintainer quit after those discussions. He was very stressed, I guess, about the discussions on Rust. But there is a gradual move for some modules to Rust, and there's hope someday that maybe in the file system we'll have a few examples. And the reason I, as a maintainer, like that is I'd like fewer bugs. Rust probably would save me 1 out of 4 bugs. And I would like that. Now, leveraging eBPF more, the File System Summit usually co-located with the eBPF Summit, and it's kind of science fiction like some of the things that can be done with dynamic tracing now. It's insane. Let's say there's discussions about using compressions in the page cache and encryption. And of course, we always have discussions about the insane layering that now goes on from slow mounts to the cloud in Indonesia to ultra-fast AI mounts for NVMe. Now, let's focus just on file systems. File systems were about 4% of the lines of code, but more than double that of the changes, and it gets much more attention. Like Linus in his weekly report, I think 2 of the last 4 weeks mentioned SMB. I think he mentioned NFS in this last week. He mentions typically things in file systems a lot more, and it gets a lot more attention. The kernel file systems are only 1.2 million lines of code, a quarter the size of Samba, but they get a lot of attention. I got automated messages, a few of them yesterday, from tooling that is scanning my code. Lots of caches, lots of progress the last year. But the most dramatic thing, which I think you guys have all heard about, is bcachefs. Many of you guys heard of that? Many people thought it would be the file system of the future. Now it looks like it's going to be removed from the kernel at some point. It is no longer maintained officially. The externally maintained tag has been added. That was quite a bit of drama, but I think basically what that message is make sure you play nicely in the community, follow the rules, interact well, accept feedback, and hopefully we don't have drama like this. We will have some interesting things removed. I think RiserFS is a good example. The System 5 will JFS be removed. The old NTFS was removed. Some of these older file systems are finally being removed after many years. Okay. Now, what were the most active file systems? Well, the VFS layer itself, and I think the last talk mentioned many things of the VFS layer itself, had 684 change sets, but it was, a lot of activity was up, and partly for some of the reasons in the last talk that were being discussed. Now, what are the most active file systems? Bcachefs. Well, that's stopped. So obviously, all activity has stopped in Bcachefs for the last 3 or 4 months. It's frozen, it's not taking merge requests, so that'll go away. File system activity will probably drop as a result of that next year. But BTRFS is still over 1,000 change sets a year. Is incredible. That's up 30%. XFS was down, but still, that's almost 700 change sets. F2FS was up a lot. ext4 was up, it's 300. But for the non-local file systems, I think SMB is like the 3rd most active or 4th most active file system with, it's actually a little bit more than that because a few were merged last week, but 393. And then you can see the NFSD, there's Chuck over there, and the NFS client. The NFSD activity has been increasing. It's been a very active year for sifs.ko, but you can see some of the things that people talk about a lot in the past, like Ceph and things like that. They don't really get many changes. OCFS2, a lot of these things that were popular 5 or 6 years ago. The focus on network file systems is still SMB and NFS after 40 years. Okay, so what are the largest file systems? Well, VFS layer is smaller, but XFS, no surprise, and BTRFS. And then SMB, the SMB stuff. Sorry about that. Okay, so the SMB activity was very strong this year. 393 change sets. We're up to 60-something lines of code. The ksmbd activity is up from last year, but it's less than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Notice the Samba user space tools is way huger than any of these other things. But one thing that just made me very happy was, and you probably saw the talk that Sasha gave on using AI to intelligently figure out what to mark CVEs and what to backport to stable. Oops, sorry about that. I should have turned off auto activity, auto whatever. One of the things that made me very excited was that the backports were huge. 340 change sets were backported to 6.6 stable. That's half the SMB change sets. A typical file system is about 20%. So this is good news. What that means is we're getting fixes and features back into 6.6 kernel, and obviously 6.12 stable as well. These long-term stable kernels matter a lot, but what got me so happy is it's not just about stuff that was merged today that you'll see in 2 years. It's also seeing stuff getting backported at a very good rate for sifs.ko, much better than most file systems. And a lot of that's due to the automation that Sasha's doing, and a lot of that's due to good responses to Greg KH when he asks questions. Now, we want SMB to be the most fast, secure, general purpose way to access. You'll obviously have specialized file systems that handle narrow workloads. But a lot of that, to achieve that, is going to require improving direct release support, which is a challenge. Direct releases are complicated. Using more compounding to reduce round trips, improving multi-channel, doing a better job of allocating requests on channel to get dynamically setting up the right number of channels, dynamically setting up the right number of maximum direct releases and file leases, and then improving the POSIX support. So one of the things we can do is use XFS tests over and over again. They add XFS tests every month. These are the standard file system test suite, and use them to locate new features that we have to emulate in SMB. But we need to more quickly add them so we don't wait 3 or 4 years. And one of the things that people forget is that unlike POSIX, the Linux API grows every year. I'll give an example that's recent, right? File get adder, file set adder, just recently added. But here's another example. Samba spent a lot of time dealing with the open at issue. Basically, symlinks are a curse, a security curse. And Jeremy Allison and others on the Samba team spent literally years fixing thousands of places where symlinks could be inserted in path-based calls. So you want to be using open at. Well, guess what? They've also added it for other path-based calls in 6.13 kernel. So some of these actually may be very important, 10 out of 10 for security, to avoid some of the security problems with symlink insertions that that caused years of headache for Samba, for example. But these are added every year, new FSCTLs, new flags, new syscalls. So this isn't like POSIX, right? So we have to keep figuring out, some of these have no bearing on SMB clients. Some of these are handled at the VFS layer. Some of these we won't care about for 3 years, but we do have to keep watching them as they grow every year. Now downstairs we have a plug fest going on. We had one at Samba XP that seemed to work well. Lots of exciting things being tested. We had an open house, I think, was it Monday? Monday, yeah. And so people got a chance to talk with some of the people. I find these plug fests incredibly useful for a little bit overwhelming because you're trying to prepare your slides, and 12 people are coming up to you with bugs they found. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about ksmbd. I don't want to focus on it a lot. In years past, sometimes Namjay would provide me some slides I could talk about. He wasn't able to travel here this year. But a lot of the area where you're seeing improvements in ksmbd recently has been in RDMA, smbdirect. Some of the Metz's work has found some bugs. They made some POSIX extensions improvement and various bug fixes. What is exciting to me is there's a guy, I'm going to mispronounce it, but Wang Zolong, who's doing a huge performance improvement on the server side in the read path that looks very promising. Also, the native symlink support, Namjay's got targeted for the next release, 6.18. And there's a lot of interest in getting the new quick driver, which is getting a lot more attention in testing, getting the new quick driver used by the ksmbd transport layer. It's not a large change to ksmbd to use it, but it would be very helpful because there are times when you're sitting in like a Marriott hotel versus a Hilton hotel and trying to figure out, is port 445 blocked? What I used to do is I used to have my presentation on an SMB mount remotely. So I would be giving my presentation, but it was stored remotely. Well, now half the hotels block 445, and even in Microsoft, some of the buildings block port 445. So Quick avoids that problem. And it's kind of exciting for multiple reasons because a lot of the internet traffic goes over Quick and people are more familiar with it. Okay, so on the client, one of the things I've been very excited about is multi-channel continues to improve a lot. And Shyam Prasad and others have done some good work on that. My goal is to enable it by default pretty soon, maybe the 6.19 kernel, 6.20 kernel. The one thing that I'm holding back on enabling multi-channel by default, because obviously it can give, having 2 channels can give you an 80% performance improvement. Having 4 channels can give you, a 300% improvement for a lot of workloads. The problem we have is that there are lots of cases where a misconfigured server will advertise interfaces that are unreachable, and so multi-channel can cause mount to take 4 or 5 minutes sometimes if you have unreachable interfaces that it keeps trying to ping and connect to. As soon as we have that code done asynchronously in the background, so mount succeeds while we in the background try to set up the optimal number of channels, when that's done, I think we can probably turn on multi-channel because we've been doing this for years now. And it's great to be able to test not against Windows only, not against Samba only, not against ksmbd only, but against a huge variety of servers and see this incredible performance we get out of it. But I also want to dynamically set up the number of channels rather than today where we sort of force the user to say, I want max channels 2 or 4 or 6 or 8, whatever. Because the user really doesn't need to know that. This is something we ought to just dynamically do unless the user wants to force it. Now, David Howells and others, Matthew Wilcox, have been doing great work on folios and netfs. Getting more I/O in flight for sequential reads with multi-channel is something being worked. Better support for cached writes. That actually got in there. There's some good changes there. And David's very excited about the idea of doing content crypto and how to integrate that with the page cache and how to integrate compression with the page cache and some of these things. But there's some kind of exciting performance improvements that David's been working. One of them at the socket layer, for example, I'll talk about later. But what are my favorite improvements? Well, my favorite thing is that POSIX extensions seem to be working pretty well to multiple servers. And I'll show you in a few slides things that excite me about directory release performance, which I think is really cool and is, we're 10% there. There are 90% more performance improvements we can still do. And just from one of Jim's people, Enrique, literally, I have 3 patches in progress just from one of your guys that improved our release performance. And then we have ones from others as well, from some of our India team and some of the Red Hat developers. But anyway, as we keep testing, I'm going to keep adding more. You know, I think we talked last year about, for example, get FSU UUID. Well, there already is an SMB FSCTL for that. Well, why don't we support it? Okay. So dir leases are going to be a huge help in reducing I/O. But you know, obviously, we're doing baby steps. We don't support all of the cases where directory leases help. So, for example, negative entry lookup isn't handled as well as it should. But here's an example I did where I'm just going to do ls of a directory twice. And I reset the stats so you see how many requests are actually sent on the wire. For, you know, after you do an ls, what is the subsequent, you know, future LSs? How much traffic? How many requests sent? 0. So once we've done an ls of a directory, future ls of the directory costs 0. That's what we want, right? No round trips, no server load, faster performance, 0 round trips needed because directory leases. Okay, so that's good. We fixed the case where it was kind of a stupid bug, but the API changed in the kernel, and the how we matched whether a directory lease matched another directory lease was broken because of a change at the VFS layer that confused us. Anyway, so bottom line, we fixed that. This is a great example of perf improvements. You know, if you don't have direct releases, that extra LS took 17 round trips and 13 for scratch, 30 more, right? 30 versus 0. I think I'll take the 0. Now here's another example where you have some stats in LS. So with dir leases, you have 3 SMBs sent. Without direct releases, you have 10. So once again, this example is where you're doing basically stat of a couple directories and stat of a file. So you go from 3 to 10. You know, good performance improvement. Now, the even better thing, of course, is that it'll continue to improve. Just the ones I talked about from Enrique are going to improve performance a lot. So reducing the number of I/O round trips is a big goal over the next year. And like I said, there's 6 or 7 patches I think that Barath has in queue, and there's some from Enrique as well as others to improve this. Now, what I also like is it's easier to debug it. So I did a find on that directory, and you can see, you know, it's now easy to dump out what's being cached and whether we were able to cache not just the directory entries, not just the file info that the directory exists, but also the directory entries. There's 2 values to directory releases. One is that Linux is a very chatty VFS. So opening file means you're opening parent dir1, parent dir2, parent dir3, parent dir4 file, which is a lot of round trips. Being able to have valid file info, or directory info basically, for that means that you don't have to send those revalidates for all the parent directories. Being able to cache the directory contents mean that all those files in it don't have to, you know, stat on those files doesn't cause a round trip. But clearly the most valuable is the first, the valid file info. So knowing, for example, that dir1 exists, or knowing that /dir1 /dir2 exists, saves round trips on every single file we try to access under that. And it also allows us to, you know, not worry about AC timeout. A lot of times people will set AC timeout to very large values and you know, risk having apps break because you know, they want to avoid round trips. This is a much safer way to do it. Anyway, so it's very easy to debug. Dir leases much easier. Also, I think Barath had 2 additional patches for improving debugging of this that were added recently, and we've got some more queued for 6.18. The POSIX extensions made good progress to Samba and ksmbd. We're going to remove the experimental warning in the 6.18 kernel, we think, or at worst 6.19 kernel. We are debugging a few bugs. So here's an example, you know, 3.14, where you can see the mode doesn't match exactly what we expect. Now, the problem I talked about last night with the mode bits to Samba turned out to be just a Samba config thing, that configuring Samba with ACL inheritance turned off mode bits. So if I create 512 files, each with every possible mode bit, 512 directories with each possible mode bit, and then try chmod to each possible combination for files and directories, they all work to Samba now. But we do have some test examples like 314 where it looks like we're inheriting something wrong. And here's another example where chown incorrectly is failing. So these are two examples that we're debugging downstairs. So we're very excited about this. And we've got a few things to debug through, but I think that this is basically a huge win even today for customers. Customers will find many, many things working now that weren't available before. Now, we've added a number of mount options over the last year. Some were trivial, like pass2 is a synonym for password 2. Last year, we talked about password rotation, the importance of rotating security account keys. But having that synonym is minor. We don't care about SMB1 stuff. No Unicode, who cares? The NB session init, same kind of thing. Do we really care about NetBIOS session init? Well, there's still a few SMB1 users, so okay. But the ones that matter, lots of changes in symlinks. We now can handle all the different types of symlinks. Windows has multiple ways to symlinks are handled. There are times where you have to force one over the other, right? Because you're trying to be able to default to something that, it's different for WSL on the Windows NFS server and services for Unix in the past. And my preference, of course, is MF symlinks, even though they're named after me and Conrad Minshall, because to me, they're safer. They're only visible on the client. We don't really want servers to have symlinks. We really just want the client to know about it because there's always that feeling that symlinks on the server could cause issues with security. But these are client options. The rest are typically stored as reparse points on the server. Now you can choose that. The other one that's 10 out of 10 important has been upcall target. There's Kubernetes kind of workloads. There's things like this where we have to know whether we want to be in the namespace of the app or the namespace of the mount to pull credentials. So this upcall target is very important for some of the workloads, the container workloads. Okay, so RDMA. So Metz here has been spending 24 hours a day, I think, for the last 2 months or something on RDMA. I find this very exciting. And the goal here, having a common module that can be used by the kernel server, the kernel client, will reduce bugs, right? Because you're going to have more eyes on the code and more uses of, the kernel server and the client using the same library is less likely to break something. Now, this will be an SMB common. He's got 100 and something patches queued for, 170 patches queued for the next release for this. It's very exciting work, but to me, one of the most exciting things is what Windows showed is smbdirect has nothing to do with SMB. smbdirect is just a mapping layer to make RDMA easier. So storage space is direct in Windows, apparently. You had lots of use cases where it had nothing to do with SMB, but smbdirect made it easy to use RDMA. And so what this means is that Samba client tools, but also AI tools that have nothing to do with SMB can leverage accessing RDMA easier with smbdirect. So I think that's very useful. It's very well documented. But I think you've only spent 24 hours a day for a long time. There's a lot to look through on that. But I find it great because RDMA gives you low latency and higher throughput. And this is fantastic stuff. And especially with multi-channel, this is a godsend for performance. But what we found is that the code that Long Lee and others wrote 6 or 8 years ago for smbdirect kind of aged a bit. And it was a little bit better on the kernel server, but on the kernel client, there were some bugs that crept in. And this testing that's been going on at the Plugfest and over the last 3 or 4 months has found 4 or 5 important bugs. I've got even one queued up for sending out tomorrow to Linus. But this I find incredibly exciting. And once again, it may not mean that smbdirect has anything to do with SMB. This may be also being used simply by AI tools that want an easier way to access RDMA. I just wanted to quickly go through, release by release. This is something you can use in the slides later if you want to understand when something got put in. These dynamic trace points, improved compression support. Now, the compression support is still experimental. Enzo has been busy with directory release bugs and things Jim's been assigning him. But Enzo does say he's going to be getting back to adding some additional compression features over the next 6 months. But contributions there are welcome. The beauty of compression support is there are cases when you're trying to mount to Indonesia where that sending a smaller packet over the wire, i.e. compressed, is worth the extra CPU cost of compressing it. There are certainly cases where compression is helpful when you have long latencies over the wire. And it's a nice feature of SMB that Windows supports well. David's been doing NetFs caching improvements pretty much every release. I talked about the upcall target thing. Password rotation is incredibly important for many workloads because people want to make sure every few weeks or months the security account keys change. And there were some password rotation corner cases that were fixed. We also added it for SMB1. May not matter as much. Chmod and querying special files types were added in 6.13. So I think starting in the 6.13 kernel, there was a lot you could do with the POSIX extensions. You could disable reparse points in the 6.14 kernel. There were a lot of good multi-channel improvements. Sham's been working on a set of performance improvements I find exciting, and some of Mitachi's team as well, that have been doing some cool multi-channel things to improve how channels are allocated and to improve reconnection. Now, one of the things we deal with in Azure, remember Azure, the biggest file server in the world, one of the things we have to deal with a lot is a host moving, right? The IP address changing. You're moving from one host to another due to load. And getting all those corner cases working, getting all the DFS corner cases working, getting the multi-channel ones working were important especially for Azure. And there was good improvement in there on 6.14. I don't remember if this was the Amazon guys. I forget who did this, but sudo xadder, so you could receive just the SACL, the owner information or whatever, via sudo xadder. Makes it easier for tooling if you want to retrieve security information from the ACL. We don't care about SMB1 fixes as much. The multi-channel fixes from Broth and others in 6.15 were very helpful. There was a perf improvement from Paolo at Red Hat for path name processing. So 6.16, remember I showed you that perf improvement for directory leases in the earlier slide? That's in 6.16, better reuses directory cache content. The Enrique, I think actually, Jim's team, did the parent lease key support so we don't accidentally do an unneeded lease break to ourselves. One of the problems we have is that, we have cases where we only have a single client accessing the data, we're caching the information, but we forget to pass a lease key. That can cause us to break a lease key in a single client scenario where we should still be caching. This parent lease key reduced a couple of those cases. Thank you, Enrique. More NetFs fixes from David, more multi-channel reconnect improvements from Mitachi's teammate Sham. We had a case that was kind of annoying. We need to add tests to catch things like this, where mounting with sec equals KRB5, we were only doing single channel, even if you had multi-channel. We had another example that somebody was talking to us yesterday with RDMA versus RSS, where we'd end up with a single channel instead of multi-channel due to a bug in how the channel allocation was working. So this was a nice fix. So yes, now with Kerberos, multi-channel works properly. The improvements to deferred close are very important. Just yesterday, I got a very important deferred close fix that I'll be sending off hopefully Friday or Saturday. And then this thing is an interesting question about remapping file characters. I'm kind of curious what people's opinions are on this. The example that's confusing is today in Linux you could open file:stream, but in Linux you could create a file named file:stream. In Windows, colon is a reserved character, so it would be an alternate data stream hanging off file. But in POSIX, opening file:stream would be looking for literally a file with that name, not a file named file, and a stream hanging off it. You'd be looking for a file with a name with a colon in the middle of the name. With POSIX, we got to allow that. So this is going to change a bit what happens when you try to open file:stream with POSIX. But fortunately, this is not an issue for Samba or ksmbd. It might be an issue for Windows in the future if Windows adds support for this. We did add some cool debugging things, new trace points for tracking leases that are helpful. And RC6, as you know, just came out, so it's expected that in about 10 days, we'll have 6.17 kernel out. We've got about 3 client fixes and I think 2 server fixes that I'll be sending out this week. But it's been a very, very active release. And I was excited about it being very active release until I saw that with Metsys patches and others, this will be the most active release in SMB history with your changes, if we can test them all. But I think it's extremely exciting. The 6.17, it was very active. 6.18 is going to be even more so. Now, there's other stuff besides Metsys stuff that's going on that's very exciting. There's a huge performance in the write path to handle small writes that David's working on. He doesn't think it's going to make 6.18, but he thinks it can make 6.19. He's also has changes that are getting pretty close to the transport layer that better manage how we take the array of pages that we're trying to send to the socket, and instead of corking and uncorking the socket, basically passing them down a little saner. And that's what he's found is it's about a 5% improvement in SIF's performance by restructuring the SIF's transport code to better handle passing all those pages down. So he's still testing these out, but it's likely to make 6.18, and it's about a 5% perf improvement, restructuring the code a little bit saner and not having to use cork and uncork. These direct release perf improvements, I think we talked about 3 from Enrique alone. There's 7 or 8 from Bharat, I think, that are pending that we're expecting in 6.18. I think there'll be a new mount option to let you control some of the release features. And then I don't know if it'll make it, but this supporting SMB3.1.1 mounts over quick, I think, is probably something that'll be more likely in the 6.19 kernel. It's not a very big change, but to the kernel client. But I find it very exciting for one selfish reason. I work out of Austin. Spectrum blocks port 445, and Google Fiber stopped 2 doors from my house. So if Google Fiber had gone 2 doors farther, I could have accessed Azure shares in the cloud. I could have accessed servers remotely. I could have saved my stuff securely with the strongest encryption, the military-grade encryption. I could be having incredibly secure ways of doing my presentation and saving it remotely. But instead, Spectrum blocks it, and Google's 2 houses away. So until Quick is there, I'm stuck. I've got to, I can't save my presentation remotely and show you, giving my presentation with the file saved in Indonesia. Now, oops, sorry. We had recent debugging improvements, more dynamic trace points added. We had fewer added this year than last year, so I want to encourage people, when you're debugging a customer problem or a problem in a test lab like this, if there's not a trace point for it, let's add it. Now, coming up, we have Mitachi, see her in the back. She's giving a talk on some really cool tooling for this. But we always want to encourage people to suggest new tooling, new trace points, because they'll help everybody. And they're so, these trace points have been an incredible feature of Linux that have helped. Coming soon, I think what you're going to see is improving directory entry caches. You'll see better performance. You'll see better use of compounding. We've talked for a long time, following a suggestion from David Goebbels and others, of doing 1 fewer round trip for most querydirs, and also improving how much we get back on querydir. Today in querydir, we open the directory query info as a compound, but then we do it again. And 95% of the time, the second querydir says no more files. Well, why don't we just compound the second querydir in there so we get the no more files on the first request we sent? So what that would mean is that in 90% of the chance, we have 1 fewer round trip. It's only for very large directories that we'd have more round trips. So that's an example of where compounding can reduce the number of round trips and improve performance. We talked about the quick thing. We talked about the RDMA helper module. Enzo may not have time now, but he's going to be improving the compression support. We had a patch from Junma that I didn't merge because it had a few minor problems. but that basically allowed us to emulate O temp file support. I may revisit that and clean up her patch. One of the things we've also talked about is it's fairly easy to imagine, just like Samba supports VFS Fruit to do Apple extensions, there may be some value in adding support for the AAPL context on the client. It wouldn't be a large change. So, in case you want to copy a file off a Mac. The content crypto is something Dave Howells has been investigating, how to do that better. Today, you can mark a file as encrypted at rest by changing its file attributes. And you can also do the same thing compressing it at rest, but that's compressing it on the server. It's not compressing the content over the wire or encrypting it over the wire. And David's been looking at some of those. We talked about the TCP thing. Now, the additional auth mechanisms that from the talk yesterday is extremely exciting to me. But I was worried that we had kernel change necessary to recognize the new OID. But I think, based on what I just saw 30 seconds before the talk, I think there might be no change needed. I think we already match on that OID. So any changes needed to support the things that were discussed in the talk yesterday would just be user space Kerberos library things. So no kernel changes. So I think, hopefully, we'll do some more testing. We won't have any client changes needed to interoperate with the new Windows security feature for IE Kerb and Kerberos. But we'll see. Hopefully they're just user space changes, if any, because I think it's extremely important. We've talked about moving away from NTLM-v2 for, what, 100 years? 200 years? 300 years? No, we've talked about it at least for 8 or 10 years, I think. And moving to peer-to-peer Kerberos, I think Apple defaults to peer-to-peer Kerberos, right? Yeah, so, Apple's defaulted to it for a long time. So this change to Windows is very exciting. I wanted to briefly mention the user space tools. The current version is 7.4. We highly recommend that you do that. It has fixes for this in progress thing, retrying, the upcall target thing. There were minor fixes in 7.3. There was major security fixes added in 7.2. These are all in the past year. But I do highly recommend that people be running the 7.4. There's not a lot of changes in it, but there's important security things and important fixes in there that, it's not just the host namespaces, it's not just the password rotation. And on a very cheerful note, last week I got an email from the guy who maintains the man page website called man7.org. Took him a month longer than I thought, but it was very exciting and I'm thankful to him. He now has all of the CIFs, like the man pages for Mount are on there. So, and SMB info and all our tools are there. So if you want to, sorry about that. If you want to, Google mount.cifs man page, you're not getting something that's 5 years old. So one of the things that's been frustrating in the past has been, customers are like, oh, I don't see a description for, this upcall parameter. I don't see this, you added this mount parameter, but I don't see it in the man page. Well, that's because they're Googling it and they're coming up with a man page that's 4 years old. So it's nice that the main one that shows up in Google, the Man7 site, now has the CIFs ones, and every 3 or 4 months those will be updated. So I think we won't have that problem as much anymore. And I think you also see this on distros that a lot of times, they'll have updates, like 6.6 stable updates, but they won't update the utilities. So you'll have kernel code with new mount options, but you type man mount.cifs and it's going to be out of date. So I'm very excited about this man7 org now showing the. Now I'm also very excited about the XFS tests. I have a lot of to-dos here, but we're at 299 tests we run in our main test group. And that's run to, I think, maybe, it's run to Azure with and without multi-channel, Windows with and without multi-channel, Samba, ksmbd. I want to add NetApp to that and a couple others, but this is a very broad group. Thank you, Mitachi. We just added a new test case, 2 weeks ago? So thank you. This is a CIF-specific test, but it was, once again, related to a customer issue with, we can add CIF-specific ones that check for specific things like we talked about the Kerberos mount thing. With sec equals KRB5, we really ought to have a test case that with sec equals KRB5 and multi-channel checks to make sure that we mounted with multi-channel. We got multi-channel. But we also need to be adding these XFS tests for things. David Howells has been bugging me for a while about one where we need to flush before we do a query interfaces, or sorry, query ranges. You know, an XFS test that fails as a result of that. I think I fixed 2 last month, but you know, one at a time. A lot of these, and some of these can be emulated. Some of these are features we can't support. But I have a feeling we've got in the range of 10 to 20 additional XFS tests we could add with without too much work. Okay, additional, you know, external KDevOps setup run, you know, automatically SIFs against stable, but they're not SIFs developers, so they're not necessarily running a broad enough set of tests. And we also have a very promising new Azure testing framework based on Lisa that we're going to try to use for testing stable kernels, because I think, as you guys have seen, we've had 3 or 4 regressions in 6.6 stable due to like NetFs and other things, and we need to be testing a little bit better stable in, you know, the automated developer-focused testing, and catch some of these. But I'm very excited about the testing. I would love more test cases, whether they're in XFS tests or whether they're, you know, they're SIF specific. And you know, I'm very, very happy about that, because what I'm finding is that it saves me a lot of time and stress, and lets us focus on things, but it also, you know, has been extremely helpful for our customers. Okay, so we probably have just a few more minutes for questions. Did, you know, is your talk the next one, by the way, Metz? So who's the next talk? Yours, so Mitachi. So we have a talk coming up about the debugging tools, the very exciting debugging tools. But do we have any questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it would actually be if we could just spend a moment on the NetApp stuff and how NetApp changes are going in and how that's what sort of progression are we seeing from that, and how many of these changes have gone in are just strictly accommodating changes.
Yeah, and it's extremely confusing, because in 6.10, a lot of code got ripped out. So in 6.10, you know, he's been transitioning, you know, AFS and then pieces of SMB and pieces of NFS. You know, he's been transitioning file systems to use a mapping layer. So we have a common mapping layer between the page cache and the network file systems called NetFs. Now, we had a case recently, I say recently, it's the last year, last 6 months, where there was a fix in the 6.9 kernel. So this is the last release before this code was all ripped out and replaced. There was a fix in the 6.9 kernel that was incorrectly, that was backported from 6.4 to 6.9. And this fix caused basically a leak, caused memory allocation. Well, basically what it caused is that we weren't doing unlocks on this. So the folio puts and folio locks were incorrect. The fix, I think a Huawei guy found it and fixed it. SUSE backported it to their 6.4 kernel. What didn't apply to Red Hat, because Red Hat wasn't running a kernel between 6.4 and 6.9. But a lot of stable kernels, a lot of ones that are using stable are based on 6.6. So it affected a lot of those. And what was unfortunate about that was that it really was a fix, had nothing to do with sifs.ko, but what it caused was huge memory, extra memory consumption, which, you know, that caused apps to crash. And, you know, looking back on it, you know, the fix wasn't huge. It was, you know, like 10 lines of code fix. But it clearly could have been found. And there were, matter of fact, I think the developer who did the patch gave an XFS test example where it would have been caught. So I think one of the goals is not just to run the minimal set that whatever Google and Intel run on stable, but to run what we as developers recommend as the set. That SIFs testing group I talked about is targeted to be about 3.5 hours of testing. It's a good number, right? 3.5 hours, you know. If this had been run on that, it probably would have caught it. Now, we had another example with direct releases where we found a direct release bug where we were running the test, but we're running it to a server without direct release support turned on. So, you know, we also have those kind of things we have to deal with, is that, you know, making sure that we're running to servers with the features enabled that we're trying to focus on. But this NetFS example, you know, David does good work, great stuff, important. The code is completely different in 6.10 and later, but we have to just be careful to test it, because when changes come in outside from the VFS layer or the, you know, the caching layer, the MM layer, they can break SIFs. We had an example fortunately, I found it in a few weeks before, I think an RC2 of 6.15 or 16, where a directory caching change hurt performance like 70%. They fixed it. We found it, luckily, running against mainline. But if this had been a stable backport, we wouldn't have caught it. So that's why this being able to run things like Lisa, the build bot we have can't run on old kernels. It only can run on current kernels. But Lisa and KDevOps can run on old kernels. So one of the very exciting things we've got queued up is just making sure we as developers have some control over what's running against the stable kernels and these older kernels. So we don't have the 2 or 3 netfs chain regressions we had over the past year. And I think I gave that example of the directory entry caching thing. These are changes that came in outside of me. They didn't go through me. But there are changes that affect CIFS due to the mapping layer. OK, so other questions before we let Mitachi set up? Any other questions? Once again, love any test feedback you guys have. The next 2 days we'll be focusing on this. There's a Q&A tomorrow on the POSIX extensions. And I think that'll be useful way to get feedback. And feel free to contact me or to follow up on any of the points you see here. And we welcome any changes or any fixes you guys want to do. I'm getting fixes from something like 30 different developers from 20 different companies. It's kind of cool. It's very cool.